Artist and Finesse with you. Our first podcast of the off-season. Finesse, there's a lot to talk about. The Letang deal, handing out a bunch of contracts to old men, the free agent frenzy. Where to begin?
Yeah, I'm still a little bit, coming down from that emotional ending to the playoffs. It's a devastating way to go out. I try not to think about it. I try to stay future-oriented, but it's like every time I just keep coming back to what happened. But we're going to try to get past it tonight. We have Mike Colligan on tonight, back for his second appearance on the podcast from the Hockey Writers and Forbes Money. I think it's called Forbes Money magazine.
Forbes Sports Money.
Forbes Sports Money. Anyway, Mike, you can clear that up for us. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I had a good time last time, and I think it was trade deadline was the last time I talked with you, and we went through all the options, and I think we thought, maybe they'd do Jerome Iginla or Brendan Morrow or a defenseman. They end up doing all three, and UC Okanagan on top of that. I don't think we could have asked for too much more at that time of year.
No, and I remember having a conversation with Artistry, and we were like, we got to try to get somebody on the podcast now because if we wait till the deadline, we're going to miss everything. And so I think like the next day or 2 days later, the Pens traded for Morrow, and again, I mean, it was crazy. So
Finesse's theory, Mike, is that Shiro didn't really mean to trade for both Morrow and Iginla, that he traded for Morrow with the idea that he wouldn't be able to pay whatever the asking price was for Iginla. And then all of a sudden, Iginla wants to come to Pittsburgh, so you get two of these guys who essentially, fit not the same role, but a similar role on the team. What do you think of that theory?
I agree 100%, and I haven't heard anyone else say it, publicly or in the media. But I thought about it for a while, and I think that's exactly what happened is I know Iginla said the timeline was like a month out. He was approached by the team, or he went to the team, talked about, who are the teams that he's interested in, what's he looking for, and they came up with a list. And I think Jay Feaster wanted a list that he could go and then start to negotiate, because if Iginla came out and said, I'm only going to the Penguins, then there's no negotiation there. The Penguins have all the leverage. So they started with that list, and I agree. I think the Penguins probably saw what teams like Boston and whoever else was involved were willing to pay. And Shiro thought, you know what, I can't afford this. And once Iginla moves, guys like Brendan Morrow, Jaromir Jagr, the price just gets higher and higher then, because now even more teams are desperate. So he tried to jump the gun, and he ended up almost costing himself, because now he's in a situation to get Iginla, and he couldn't pass up that opportunity, at that kind of price.
Then you got to squeeze everybody onto the roster. So fast forward to today. A lot has happened since the end of the season. And I know you just had a piece on the Hockey Writers about what the Penguins' next move is, and you touched on a lot of issues, the primary one being the acquisition of Scuderi, which is an interesting case, because I think we agree with you that at the time he left the Penguins, Scuderi had the good fortune to have a great showing on a national platform, and his price went through the roof. He signed with the Kings for what at that time seemed like an astronomical sum for a defenseman of that nature. I think it was around 3.4 or something like that. But ironically, 5 years later, it seems to me, and I want to know if you agree with this, he got around the same number from the Penguins. And in this day and age, that seems like just the right number for a defenseman like Scuderi. And he seems like the one big-name free agent that wasn't massively overpaid.
I think it's a pretty good value. The concern is the term for me, the number of years, 4 years at $3.375 million. So the first couple years, he's absolutely going to be worth that. He's still a good defenseman. He played the highest minutes, I think, of his career in Los Angeles last year. I don't think he was as good as he's been, but it certainly could have been an off year. I'm concerned about what he looks like as a 38-year-old, and I know that question was brought up to Ray Shero, and he brought up a good point. He said, if I'm worried about what Scuderi's going to look like at 38, I'm not going to get him. And I don't think that's Shiro necessarily ignoring the future and just being blind and like some of these general managers and just saying, I don't care about David Clarkson for 7 years. I want him for the next 2. Shiro's not that type, but I think term has become the currency in this at least this year, where the salary cap dropped from 70 to 64 million. There's only so many dollars to go around. So now you've got to give no trade clauses. You've got to give extra years. You've got to find ways to kind of differentiate yourself if you want to win over a guy like Rob Scuderi.
And I think that the danger's a little less with what the Penguins have done than it is for other teams. Like the term and money for Scuderi and Kunitz and Dupuis might be a little bit high, but it's not, cap crippling high. It's like, maybe you're paying a 38-year-old Rob Scuderi $3.375 million or something when he's worth $2.5 million or $3 million. It's not like you're going to have a David Clarkson who might be getting 30 points and at age 37 and really not contributing anywhere close to $5.5 million. So it's a calculated risk, but I don't think. Let's say that Kunitz, Dupuis, Scuderi all turn rotten at the same age. I don't know that's. You can still find use for them on your roster, you know what I mean, without it killing the rest of your cap, which is probably going up anyway.
I think 2 factors there, and that was one of them, is the salary cap, where you talked about Rob Scuderi a few years ago at $3.4 million that was a lot. The cap wasn't at this level, and if you look at it on that kind of relative basis, it's a different story. And if the cap continues to rise, which I've heard it $75 million within 2 years, which is hard to believe. $11 million increase. All of a sudden, now you're going into those tail years of Dupuis and Kunitz and Scuderi, and even if they're at $2 or $3 or $4 million, that's nothing at that point. If the cap's at 80 or even above, it's not a big deal. And I think the other point you mentioned was a guy like David Clarkson, where you're getting him for, not all skill and scoring, but those are the things that you're going to need him to do. You can't have him just scoring 10 points a year and going out in the 4th line at that kind of money. Whereas you look to Scuderi, is his skill set really going to diminish as he gets older? What does he do besides just kind of make the safe play? And we've seen so many defensemen do that and play that kind of game well into their 30s.
I got to bring something up with you, Mike, though, that I disagreed with what you wrote. And I'm willing to relitigate the past, something that happened 4 years ago and actually turned out to be a good play. You said that Scuderi got burned on that Ovechkin breakaway in Game 7. I think I totally agree with you that Scuderi and Gill, this notion that there was some shutdown pairing in the playoffs was so overblown, especially in the Washington series because Ovechkin killed us in the Washington series. But on that particular play, I think Crosby made a lazy centering pass. And then one of the Capitals just kind of threw it up the boards, knowing that he's on the ice with Ovechkin, who cherry picks. And keep in mind, this is 2009 Ovechkin, who was burning everybody at the time. And so while you say Scuderi got burned, I think Scuderi made a great effort to get back and forced Ovechkin into getting in tight on Fleury and not being able to get the puck over his glove. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm gonna just change the subject so I don't have to answer to that. But you brought up Crosby in the play, and you think of the playoffs too, where he had a lot of those giveaways. And I think 2 years ago he was great defensively. He was a great two-way player. He was playing goal line to goal line. Last year he was not good in the defensive zone. And James Neal's a guy that gets criticism for the same thing. Not great defensively, but the guy's not a complete player. That's fine. That's why he's not making $9 million. But Sidney Crosby, you expect to be a great two-way player. And I don't know that the defensive game was there for him last year. I thought it was kind of disappointing. I
agree. And to piggyback on that point, and I guess we'll get this gets a little technical on the ice, but I think one of the problems with Bylsma's system, and you always hear about coaches' systems, but nobody ever talks about what it is. I think a lot of the reason that the defensemen turn the puck over so much is because the forwards are so far away from them coming out of the zone. And like you saw in the Islanders series especially, every long pass was just the Islanders were just pinching on the boards and knocking everything down. And it's very difficult to break out of the zone when you have to pass it through somebody. rather than like making, everybody getting close together. So, we can get to Bylsma, I guess, but that's definitely an area where the Pens need to grow, I think. Get a little bit tighter coming out of their own zone.
I mean, you hear Bylsma talk about puck management. I mean, I listen to his press conference every night, and when the Penguins play bad, it's puck man. He throws out these cliches, and I think people get on him about that, but puck management is exactly what you're talking about, where when you have a team that's always stretching the ice, and that's the way they play, and you say, there's good and bad things about that, but when you're stretching the ice and you're sending your forwards, you can't afford a turnover. You can't do it because it's going back the other way. It's more than often an odd man rush, and you've got to manage the puck, make sure that your passing is good. That was a lot of the problems I thought late in the year and into the playoffs was guys just weren't on the same page, whether that was, so many line changes or whatever. Just a lot of puck management and turnover problems that were really burning the Penguins in a lot of those games.
Is that the personnel sort of rebelling against this system, whether it's a conscious thing or not? Because these guys have been playing in the system for most of them for a number of years.
It's a good point. I would say just too much turnover. There was the Crosby injury. In fact, actually, there were a lot of injuries down the stretch. Neal and Martin, and then all the trade deadline pickups. I think it was just too much, too quick, and on and off the ice, I don't think that the chemistry really had a chance to develop. I mean, on the ice, I think that's where it shows up, is when you don't know where guys are going to be and you don't know where the pass is. In the NHL, you can't think. You can't, take a look around and see where your line mate is. You've got to know that before you pass the puck. And I think off the ice, I never got the sense that there was enough time for a guy like a Ginla or Morrow to get comfortable and kind of gain the respect of the locker room. And you brought them in because of their leadership abilities, but they never had the time to gain that respect. And there's no way that they were standing in someone's face and calling someone out in between periods. I mean, the things that you would expect a leader to do in challenging times, there's no way that was happening in that Penguins locker room. And I think they just didn't have enough time to gel and come together.
Yeah, the short season might have been the worst season to do 4 giant moves like the Pens made. Because I think Ginla played like 11 games or something with the Penguins and none with Crosby. Like 2 minutes with Crosby. And that's a big part of why the chemistry wasn't there. But you said something about not having to think, like knowing where your line mates are and stuff on the breakouts. And I think thinking is a good transition to Chris Letang's extension, because he often looks like he's not thinking at all. Like he sort of assumes his line mates might just be somewhere and he just gets rid of the puck, or he's a little bit lazy with the management of it. And I wonder, like, all this criticism of Bylsma and his system and a lot of other players, with Letang specifically, like how much do you think he has room to kind of clean up the very few elements of his game that make us wary of his extension? Because if he can clean up a few things, then he's going to be a bargain at $7 million.
I think the first perspective would be you can teach a guy to clean up his game. You can teach a guy to play defense. You can't teach a guy to skate like Chris Letang does. It's just he has a skill set that's so unique. And he continues to get better. He continues to become a better skater. That's something you can't teach. So he has the tools. There's the mental side of the game. I mean, one thing I've thought about is last year I thought Jordan Staal had some issues defensively where he was shirking some of his defensive responsibilities, trying to get up ice, trying to score. And I think he saw a contract year coming, an opportunity to really cash in, and he thought, no one's going to pay me for being a great third-line defensive center. People are going to pay me if I score 50 or 60 or 70 points. And I think, that really changed the way he played. And I noticed a lot of the similar breakdowns in Chris Letang, where if Chris Letang stops a rush 2-on-1, he's not getting paid for that. He's getting paid for being a point-a-game defenseman. And if he hit the open market, that's what would have happened is people would say he's Norris Trophy, he's a point-a-game. And meanwhile, you look at the Norris Trophy, it's the top 3 scorers in the league. So I think Letang can definitely fix up part of those games. I think part of the problem was they kept switching up his line mates. They were switching up the sides he was playing on. So there's, again, so much change. And change is good at times, but I think it can also lead to breakdowns as well.
Ironically, though, Mike, it was Letang's poor performance defensively in big moments against Boston, which had everybody talking about, man, if not for that Boston series, his trade value would just be through the roof. You know, if he were a UFA right now, he could command $9-10 million.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, that view, if that is what he had, whether consciously or subconsciously, backfired on him. And I just wonder now, I think, you know, we talked a lot about what we could get for Letang in a trade. We had a lot of mixed feelings about it. But in retrospect, now that we're a little bit detached from the emotion of that Boston series, if we lose Chris Letang, if we trade Chris Letang right now, we're not getting a 27-minute-a-night guy back. And that's a hole that's virtually impossible to fill in the short term. Now we have him signed at that $7.25 million cap figure. And I want to know, after seeing what happened last week in free agency, how good does that extension look, and how much better is it going to look going forward?
I think it's what you guys said, where it depends on what happens. This is a guy that's 26. You know, that contract doesn't take into effect until he's into his prime, and so we'll see how he develops as a player. But I think if he does continue on the trajectory that he's on, and again, we look at the playoffs, you have the tendency to really focus on that because that's the last thing you remember. But he's a guy, when you think back 3 or 4 years ago, he's made a lot of progress. He's come a long way from where he was probably 3 seasons ago. And so I think in the future, if he continues to develop, that contract becomes a steal. I think people will be shocked at where some of these contracts go in the next 3 years. As this ever, numbers will go through the roof. Guys will be getting $10 million, and people will be thinking that, okay, that's decent value. And so we'll look back on that if he continues to develop, and I think it'll be pretty good value.
So talking about the way this roster is structured right now, does Dan Bylsma's system sort of necessitate filling out the roster with veterans who are familiar with the system? And, you know, I think if you look at Shiro's moves this offseason in isolation, you can't really argue with any of them because they're good value just in a vacuum. If you look at Dupuis, Kunitz, Craig Adams, all these guys, Scuderi, all of them are good value. But just because you can get a bargain doesn't mean you take it every time. Do you agree with the way that this team is being put together? You know, all things being equal, if it's because these are the guys that need to play in Bylsma's system, then I guess that is what it is. We've committed to Bylsma, but I thought that giving him an extension would give him the freedom to make some maybe difficult choices regarding putting a young guy in a key role in the lineup instead of recycling guys, which puts us in a position, as we discussed, in a couple years to have a really, really old lineup.
Well, I think, first of all, you can look back on the last year or 2 or 3 even and look how much things have changed. I mean, if you go back a year and a half ago, Jordan Stahl's on the team, Jerome McGinley's not even a thought. I mean, there's just been so much changes, and I never appreciated that for a while, but I think Ray Shiro said it in some of his press conferences where he used to think 5 years in advance, and they had all these 5-year plans about where the team was going and what it would look like. And they throw them out the window 6 months from now because, you know, a goalie falls apart or someone else steps in and becomes surprisingly good. And so that's the biggest challenge, I think, as far as those deals go and sticking with the guys that they did. There's 2 factors there. The first would be what you would call opportunity cost. So if you lose a guy like Pascal Dupuis, a top-line guy, a penalty killer, a great even-strength player, what are you going to do to replace him? Do you have that guy in your system? I mean, we could argue Bo Bennett, but you kind of need him on other lines. What is it going to cost to go out and get a David Clarkson? And you look at what these guys signed for in free agency. If you can keep Dupuis, it makes a lot of sense because it's just going to cost you so much via trade or free agency to replace them. I think the other factor would be you know that Dupuis fits right now. And we looked at Jerome Iginla and Alexei Ponikarovsky was the guy a couple years ago. You just don't know if these guys are going to fit. And when you're dealing with top six players, top six forwards, that's what I'm always scared about is you just never know if a guy's going to fit in with what you want. And so when you got to give up a lot of money or a lot of assets to get one of those guys and you're not 100% sure on them, that's a big risk. And so I think that's what kind of leads to saying, you know what, if we can keep these guys in the mix, we know they fit, we know they're good value at these dollars, we'll take our chances with this team, and more often than not, we'll probably be in pretty good shape.
One guy who has fit for a long time, and you sort of made mention in your column about possibly trading him before he gets to unrestricted free agency, is Brooks Orpik. He's a free agent after this season. He's going to be I think he might be a year or two younger than Scuderi, but he's not that much younger than Scuderi. I guess I think at some point you can't look at everything as, well, we got to maximize assets. Sometimes you just got to let a guy go to unrestricted free agency and, hope he can stay. Do you think the Pens will do anything with Orpik? Does it depend? I mean, obviously it depends on how some of these young guys develop over the next, several weeks or first few months of the season. But how do you see that shaking out with Orpik? Or do we try to sign him to an extension?
I think you bring up a great point, and I've gone back and forth on it. Niskanen's the big name right now. Everyone thinks Niskanen's gone, and so I don't know if I shy away from that just because I'm trying to think a little differently, and I always try to think of all the options. But with Orpik, he'll be 33 at the start of the season. I watched him last year, and from what I could tell, he was healthy for most of the year. I think he had some injury problems, but there was just too many times where he was backing off forwards way too far. His gap was huge, and I don't know if it was lack of confidence or lack of skating ability or what is wrong in his game, but he played well other than that. But those are the little things I look at when I say, okay, if a guy's starting to regress a little bit, is he starting to kind of lose a step? And if you're going to have to pay him big money a year from now, that's the type of thing I would look at, and it would raise some questions. I think the biggest factor, like you said, with Orpik is the Penguins wouldn't be better without Brooks Orpik. And that's a huge hole when you're losing that. But, if you wait for the right deal and it comes up, I wouldn't be opposed to it. I think it'd be a big move and maybe something that would really shake up the locker room, something you may or may not want. But I think it's at least a possibility at this point.
What's funny is that you mentioned Orpik backing up to let guys shoot. That's sort of been his MO for a lot of his career, I think. And it's funny because Fleury might be the worst goalie in the league to have if you're going to have a defenseman be used as a screen on like a rushing player. I mean, he just gets burned by that all the time. And it's like, just step up. I would rather the guy, Orpik step up and slow someone down just a little bit, but the guy still gets around him, with Fleury in net, than some dude laser and, putting one under the crossbar from in between Orpik's legs. But that's just sometimes players just have flaws. You got to live with that stuff. So.
Yeah, everything beautiful has one flaw. That's what the Turkish say. My only reservation about trading Brooks Orpik right now, I agree with you, Mike. My reservation is if we have a repeat of last season where Bylsma is only comfortable playing his top three defensemen big minutes, it's sort of like we just swapped out Brooks Orpik for Rob Scuderi right back where we were, and you've got an incredibly top-heavy defense core. Now, if Bylsma is ready to commit to playing Simone Dupuis 20 minutes a night, great. Trade Brooks Orpik now, in my view, but I just don't believe he's going to do that.
The Simone Dupuis thing just blew my mind the whole year. I couldn't figure it out. I mean, I never thought he'd be on the team in the first place because I thought if he's going to sit up here in the press box or play 6 or 8 minutes a night, he's not going to develop. And you see what happened to a guy like Brian Dumoulin, who's now, I think I saw a little of him at the end of the year, and I've heard a lot of great things about him, that he's NHL ready at this point. And he was a guy I saw last summer and I thought was at least 3 years away. I thought, okay, he'll be good, but he needs a ton of work. And it shows what if you can get 26, 28 minutes a night, play in every situation in the minor leagues, it can do wonders. And so I was shocked when they put Dupuis in the team. And then they didn't play him, and they started out the year and they played him, and I thought maybe they're showcasing him for a trade because he doesn't look good in some of these games. And then he played great, and they'd yank him out of the lineup, and it didn't make sense for me. And then you get to the playoffs where you haven't given him the experience, you haven't given him the opportunity, and now you can't rely on him. I mean, he's a defenseman choice, but Simone Dupuis is not that kind of guy, or at least right now that you can rely on him to just go out and not let up a goal. That's all you want out of your third pair is don't let up a goal. We don't care if you score or do anything else. Just go out, be invisible, and get off the ice. And I don't think Dupuis was capable of that.
Do you think Dumoulin will actually get any ice time this season, or is Bylsma and Shiro too invested in? Even assuming Niskanen gets traded, you still have Dupuis ahead of him, and then Englund and Bortuzzo. So, and this is part of what's frustrating about Shiro is like a guy like Dumoulin's going to be 22 years old to start the season. He's either good or he's not. So, like I wouldn't want to see them kind of ease him in. Like if he's ready, just play him. And do you think that will actually happen? That they'll actually play him, or is this going to be like maybe if Dupuis cracks the lineup, then we have this sort of in between thing going on next season with a guy like Dumoulin?
I mean, I think the first question you got to ask is why are you doing that, and what's your motivation? And so the logical thing for me would be to get cap space to spend elsewhere in the lineup. I don't know where I would spend that. I guess on the third line at this point, maybe a goaltender if you decide to go that way. But if you're changing just to change, it goes back to what you said, is if Dumoulin is ready. We don't know that right now. We don't know if Dupuis is ready. We haven't been able to really even see if these guys are ready. But I know that Chris Letang's ready. I know that Paul Martin's ready. I know Brooks Orpik is ready. So that's the question is, do I push Dumoulin into the lineup if there's no real reason to do it? And I think that's kind of the trade-off, and people really give them a hard time about not moving the younger guys up. But you've got to have a reason to do it. And if they're in a cap crunch, I think it makes sense. I think that's where Dupuis should have been in the mix. They should have found out what they had there. But going forward, they've got to decide, they got all these young assets. How do they work them in? When do they work them in? I think that was a big problem with Joe Morrow is he wasn't going at the timeline they were expecting. And all of a sudden he was kind of back into that younger crop of guys, Derek Pouliot, Oli Mata. And now you don't need 3 or 4 guys at the same point in that timeline of development. And so I think that's why Morrow became expendable.
Right, and you got a bottleneck now. You got 5 NHL defensemen who can play legitimate minutes, right? In Letang, Martin, Orpik, Scuderi, and Niskanen. And you've got a dearth of, if not bodies, a dearth of talent on the third and fourth lines. So it seems like a perfect storm. It makes sense to move somebody and try to address your needs up front. I saw that we signed Matt D'Agostini today for the league minimum, and I never heard of the guy. Somehow he had a year that was like identical to Tyler Kennedy a couple years ago. It shows you what the benefit is of playing on national television all the time for Tyler Kennedy, I guess. He's signing for 2.4 in San Jose, and this guy's signing for the league minimum. What do you know about Matt D'Agostini? Great shot, real good skater. He's kind of, the guy that the Penguins always get. And you look at what they've gotten in the last couple of weeks here. They added Andrew Ebbett, Chris Connor, who I think Penguins fans will at least know a little bit better. He's been here before. But kind of these smallish, quick, aggressive guys. And D'Agostini's, I think the comparison to Kennedy's great because you get the Kennedy upside without the $2 million anchor contract that Kennedy had. The D'Agostini's a 2-way deal from what I think I saw today, league minimum. So if it doesn't work out, you move him down and that's fine. If it does work out, now you've got that Kennedy upside. And so he's an inconsistent guy. He's a scorer and doesn't really have the strength
But when he's on, he's a good guy that can play. I think he's played all different wings and even center a little bit, can play on the power play. That's kind of the guy the Penguins always look to get in the offseason.
You said he brings a lot of what Kennedy brings. Does that mean he's going to stick handle relentlessly?
I remember I've watched him in St. Louis, and especially the year he had 21 goals or whatever. He shoots a lot, and so that's Kennedy. But Kennedy had a good shot. People thought, made fun of him for all the times he missed the net, but he had a good shot. And D'Agostini's got a pretty good shot too. And I think he's a better skater than Kennedy, and maybe more of a goal scorer as far as his vision. I thought that was one of the biggest problems with Kennedy, was just really no on-ice vision. So he
tunnel vision.
Yeah.
Kennedy,
you can't play with Evgeny Malkin when you're like that,
Yeah.
Kennedy always struck me as like the kid at hockey practice who would just be stick handling while the coach is trying to explain a drill and like shooting against the boards, and nobody can hear what the coach is saying. Like, you're right. He has no natural, real hockey sense. He just has like a good work ethic and a pretty good shot when he can actually get it off. We're pushing time here. We've been going a long time, so I don't want to keep you too much longer. But you ended your story with a thought about maybe the Pens moving Fleury, or like, and I know it was sort of like, just something to think about. Everyone's always thinking about it. How realistic is that? What's out there? Should the Pens do it? I mean, what are your general thoughts on Fleury, who was pretty awful in the playoffs again?
Fleury, my thoughts on Fleury go back to last summer when they got Thomas Vokoun, and I was shocked by the trade and then the signing. They got him before free agency, which is a very aggressive move, and that's Shiro's style now, is to be very aggressive when he decides what he wants. But the fact that he wanted Thomas Vokoun that bad, it surprised me a little bit, and it made me start to think about Fleury. I think I just always assumed he'd be in Pittsburgh long term. He'd be a guy that if he had these playoff troubles, he'd find a way to work through it, or they would work through it with him. But I started thinking about Fleury, and he's a guy. He's 28 years old, which shocked me when I saw that the other day. We think he's a little bit younger than that, but he's kind of the old end of this core. And a goalie that relies on agility and quickness. And so 2 years from now, when his contract is up, do I want to get into a 6 or 7 year deal with a goalie that relies on agility and quickness and is heading into his 30s? I'm not so sure about that. And you look at a guy like Martin Brodeur, he's evolved through the years. That's what's allowed him to survive in different eras of the NHL. He's played different styles. He's always adapted. I don't know if Fleury's capable of being a very solid technical goalie, and I think they tried to turn him into that last year. He did very well in the regular season, but at the first sign of trouble in the playoffs, he went right back to just chaotic, and it looked like the first playoff year against Ottawa, where he was so far out of his crease, he was chasing the puck everywhere. So to me, even before the playoffs this year, Fleury's long-term future was a big question, and I think the playoffs only makes it a bigger factor. And so when I look at the league and what teams are doing at the goaltender position, they're going with cheaper options. It's becoming like closers in baseball almost, where teams get a guy, they get 2 or 3 years out of him at a decent price, and then they move on to the next one. So there's some questions there, and I'm just not convinced, no matter what happens, and even disregarding the playoffs this year, I'm not convinced from answer for the Penguins.
But what about short term? Like this season, like, is there any chance he's not on this on the Penguins on opening day?
Well, before you answer, Mike, I mean, my first thought when I hear Bylsma pumping Fleury's tires and then Shiro pumping his tires is they're thinking, how can we move this guy? How quickly can we move him? Is that your take? I mean, there are two models in the NHL right now. There's the model you're talking about where goaltenders are swapped out and you look for a cheap option, and there's the $7 million a year guys. Fleury's clearly not that. He's at 5, and he's sort of in the most awkward spot salary-wise for a goalie that's not, playing at a high level.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on a lot of those points. And when The problem was they went so overboard with that Fleury comments and saying how great he was and how much they believe in him. It was so hard to believe if you followed the team at all and you followed the playoffs and what happened. And I think Bylsma, his actions spoke louder than words when he didn't go back to Fleury. If he believed in him that much, he would have gone back to him in that that playoff position where they had to make the choice. And he stuck with Vokoun, and I thought that was the right decision. But I thought he'd go back to Fleury there, and he didn't. And I think it was twofold. If they're going to keep Fleury, they've got to get his confidence back at a level where he can compete and win hockey games again, and especially in the playoffs. So they've got to pump his tires in that way, and they've also got to make people believe that he's still a legitimate goalie as far as a tradable asset goes. And so back to the question about this year. I think you've got to start the year with them. I think at this point there's nothing in the system you can go to. You can't rely on Thomas Vokoun to play 60 or 70 games at this age. But I think they've got to be open to trades at this point. If something makes sense and they can get a goalie in that can be their goalie of the future, and that's why I mentioned Halak. St. Louis has 3 very good goaltenders. They need the cap room right now. Halak's the highest paid guy. And it's not a coincidence. He's probably going to be the one that moves. And so I look at a guy like Halak that's got playoff experience and playoff success, had some injury trouble, but if you get him for a nice cap price, that's a great long-term option for me.
How old is he, Halak?
Oh, man,
let's look it up. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, because he played a handful of years in Montreal and not sure if he played any minors at all.
Yeah. I wonder how much younger he is than Fleury. That's my question. Let's see.
I think he's about the exact same age.
He's 28. He's
28 years old.
Yeah, 1985 birthday. Well, he makes $4.5 million. That's a lot. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of exhausted with this whole Fleury thing. Like, it's just going into the season with him as the goalie. And even though I think Vokoun is good enough and was good enough this past season for the Pens to win the Cup with Vokoun. He was playing very well. But just having the whole Fleury thing going on it's getting exhausting at this point. It's been several years where he just doesn't inspire confidence, and it's like you almost watch these games like waiting for something bad to happen.
It's not going to go away. It's going to be something that
especially. I mean, he could win the Vezina for the regular season, and you still wouldn't be comfortable going into the playoffs with him.
And the same applied to the Bylsma extension. I mean, even if he didn't deserve the extension, that wasn't going away. And if they didn't extend him, they almost had to fire him because the whole year, the first time the Penguins lost, people would be calling for Bylsma's head, and it would be a distraction that just wouldn't go away. And they had to make a decision. Unfortunately, they haven't really, I guess, made a decision despite what they've said. No one really buys into it. And so now they've got this Fleury issue that's going to linger the whole year if he's on that roster.
It's going to be fascinating to watch. Great stuff, Mike, as always. We really appreciate you joining us. All right, so we'll monitor developments. We might have to have you back. I don't know. We can't promise anything. We may have you back next week. We don't know. All right, thanks for joining us, everybody. Until next time, GTOG.